Beneath the peaceful facade of Fairfield, a small town with red brick streets and an eerie serenity, a forbidden love affair between two men burns. Daniel, a passionate young scientist, and Scott, a model married cop, are locked in an affair that cannot be made public. As pent-up emotions erupt, passion and torment drive both men into dangerous decisions. Will Scott risk his family for Daniel, or will their love engulf them both in a tragedy with no way out? Fairfield, with its serene exterior, is slowly becoming the birthplace of a bloody tragedy. Daniel Carter, 25 years old, a young scientist at the Fairfield Institute of Biotechnology, is a person that everyone knows, not only because of his outstanding talent in the research field, but also because of his openness and cheerfulness with his colleagues and everyone around him. But no one knows that Daniel is living a life different from his calm appearance, a life imprisoned by a relationship that he cannot openly admit, cannot escape. Daniel is in love with a man much older than him, Scott Allen. Scott, 38 years old, is an exemplary police officer in Fairfield. He has a family, a beautiful wife, and two lovely children. With his cold appearance and inherent calmness, Scott is always admired as an exemplary husband and a respectable father. But no one knows that after each workday, Scott does not return home immediately but secretly meets Daniel. The relationship between Daniel and Scott began 2 years ago, after a chance meeting at a scientific conference. Scott found himself drawn to Daniel's innocence and sincerity. It started with scientific conversations, but the intimacy gradually turned into something more, a love that crossed the boundaries between two men living in two different worlds. Daniel knew that this relationship could not last forever in the dark. He loved Scott, but the suppression and secrecy had made his heart crack every day. The meetings were only secret. In the darkness of the small apartment, no one knew and no one was allowed to know. The loneliness and torment made Daniel increasingly uncomfortable. He wanted more, wanted to be loved publicly, wanted Scott to accept their relationship sincerely. As for Scott, he knew he was walking on a dangerous path. His love for Daniel was real, but his family life, career, and reputation were also very important. Scott loved Daniel, but he was not brave enough to break everything. The fear of losing his family made Scott colder towards Daniel, and that hurt Daniel more than ever. In recent months, the tension between them had increased. Daniel could no longer keep calm every time Scott refused to make their relationship public. Scott's promises of a future together seem like empty lies. Daniel feels pushed to the sidelines of Scott's life, like a shameful secret that Scott doesn't want anyone to know. Then one autumn evening, as the leaves fell across the streets of Fairfield, Daniel couldn't take it anymore. After a long day at work, he sat in his apartment and wrote Scott a letter, an emotional letter, in which he harped out all the pain he had endured for the past 2 years. Daniel wrote that he couldn't live in the dark forever, that he couldn't continue with his life if Scott wasn't willing to change. Daniel gave him an ultimatum. Either Scott would go public with their relationship, or they would end it all. For the first time in 2 years, Daniel dared to face the truth he had been avoiding. He knew that if Scott didn't accept, he would lose the love of his life, but at least he wouldn't have to continue living in torment and pain. Scott received the letter on a Friday. He read and reread Daniel's words, clearly feeling the anger and pain of his young lover. But Scott also understood that making this relationship public would destroy everything he had built over the years. He couldn't hurt his wife and children, but he couldn't lose Daniel either. The struggle between love and responsibility put Scott in an unprecedented dilemma. After reading the letter, Scott decided to go see Daniel to talk directly. They met on a weekend evening in Daniel's apartment. Unlike previous meetings, this time there were no longer gentle conversations, gentle smiles, or loving eyes. Instead, there was a tense, heavy atmosphere, as if there was an invisible distance between the two that could not be overcome. Daniel looked at Scott with red eyes, full of anger and disappointment. He asked Scott to clarify everything, to make a decision immediately, but Scott couldn't. He just stood there, looking into Daniel's eyes, unable to say a word. In his heart, Scott understood his feelings, but also understood that making this relationship public would mean losing everything he had: family, career, honor. Daniel couldn't control his emotions, started screaming, talking about the pain he had endured for so long. He loved Scott, but couldn't live in the dark forever. Scott, on the other hand, tried to explain that he needed time, that he couldn't make a decision right now. But all that did was make Daniel feel abandoned, despised. The tension reached its peak, and Daniel gave him a final ultimatum: either go public or end it forever. Scott couldn't respond. He turned and walked out of Daniel's apartment, leaving behind a relationship that he didn't know where it would lead. But in his heart, Scott knew that this relationship couldn't last much longer. Daniel had reached the limit of his endurance, and he was stuck in a dead-end choice. Scott left, not knowing that this meeting would mark a major turning point in Daniel's life, changing everything forever. That night, after Scott left Daniel's apartment, darkness surrounded both of them. Scott drove home, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his mind in turmoil with conflicting thoughts. What had just happened was like a knife cutting deep into his heart. Everything was still smoldering in his heart, and he knew that his choice had pushed Daniel to a limit of no return. But Scott also understood that there was no other way. He couldn't risk everything he had built: his family, his career, and his reputation for a love he couldn't make public. Scott had often wondered if he had the courage to confront his wife and children about his forbidden relationship with Daniel. The fear of losing his reputation in the eyes of his colleagues, friends, and family outweighed any emotion. His job as a police officer required him to not only keep himself clean, but also maintain a perfect image of morality and loyalty. If Scott decided to leave his family to be with Daniel, it would not only destroy his personal life, but also the career he had built for more than 10 years. The thoughts of being condemned by society and losing all respect made him speechless every time Daniel asked for a public announcement. Back home, Scott entered his small house in a suffocating silence. His wife, Sarah, had gone to bed, and his 2 children were fast asleep. The whole house exuded peace, as if nothing unusual was happening. Scott stood at the door, looking at the peaceful family scene before him, but his heart was heavy. He loved his family, but his feelings for Daniel were unquenchable. Every time he looked into Sarah's eyes, Scott felt an unbearable guilt. But that didn't change the fact that he couldn't stop loving Daniel. He tried to give up on Daniel, tried to leave him, but every time he did, Scott found himself lost. Between those 2 worlds, Scott was slowly losing himself. He sat down on the living room chair, the dim yellow light shining on his tired face. Guilt invaded his mind. Images of Daniel, his eyes full of anger and disappointment, appeared clearly in Scott's mind. He knew he had hurt Daniel, but there was no other way. Scott told himself everything would pass, Daniel would understand and forgive. But deep down, he knew he was lying to himself. As for Daniel, after Scott left, he stood silently in the empty apartment, disappointment and a feeling of abandonment engulfing him. He knew this would happen, but he didn't expect it to hurt this much. Daniel sat on the floor, staring at the empty space in front of him. He felt like a lost soul, someone who had given all his love and trust to Scott, but in return was only avoidance. Daniel had hoped, believed that Scott would choose him, would love him enough to give up everything. But the reality was more cruel than he had imagined. Scott couldn't give up his family, and that meant their love would forever be hidden in the dark. Daniel wondered, did Scott really love him, or was Scott's love just part of the lie he had told himself? In Daniel's mind, the images of Scott with his wife and child made his heart feel like it was being squeezed. He had hoped that their love would be strong enough to overcome everything, but now he realized that this love was just a dead end, a path that he could no longer continue on. Scott's rejections echoed in his mind, and each word was like a deep cut into Daniel's self-esteem. He felt like he was worthless, a part of Scott's life that was never acknowledged. As each day passed, Daniel felt trapped. He was becoming more and more distant from his former self, a meticulous, careful scientist. Now frustration and abandonment made him impatient, unable to sleep, and even neglected his work at the research institute. Every time Scott called to apologize and promise, Daniel felt more and more used. His dreams of building a life together faded, giving way to nightmares of loneliness and betrayal. His mind was no longer clear, and anger took over. In the following weeks, Daniel fell into a deep depression. He avoided seeing friends, withdrew from work, and barely left his apartment. His best friend, Maya, noticed the change but couldn't understand why. Daniel didn't tell anyone about his relationship with Scott, and this only made him feel more alone than ever. As for Scott, he tried to return to normal life. He spent more time with his family, worked hard, and tried to push Daniel's image out of his mind. But nothing could erase the empty feeling in his heart. He knew that Daniel was hurting, and that made Scott restless. Even though he had decided to leave Daniel, Scott couldn't forget his young lover. Every night Scott lay in his bedroom, listening to Sarah's steady breathing beside him, but his mind drifted to Daniel. He wondered if Daniel was okay, if he could get over it. The thought of Daniel doing something stupid scared Scott, but he knew he couldn't go back. He couldn't leave his family. But his heart still belonged to Daniel.
Then one day, Scott received a text from Daniel. It was short, but haunting. I can't go on like this. I've made up my mind. Scott felt his heart sink. Something was very wrong. He knew Daniel was on the verge of collapse. Without hesitation, Scott rushed out of the house and drove to Daniel's apartment. He didn't know what he would do when he got there, but he knew he had to go. A part of him, though he didn't want to admit it. Loved Daniel and couldn't bear to lose him. When Scott arrived, Daniel's apartment was as quiet as ever. The door was unlocked. He walked in and looked around. Everything was peaceful, but Scott felt an inexplicable anxiety. He called Daniel's name, but there was no answer. Heart pounding, Scott walked into the bedroom and saw Daniel lying there, on the bed, motionless. A feeling of dread washed over him. He rushed to Daniel's side, shaking him gently, but there was no response. Scott's heart clenched. He felt like everything he had feared had come true.
In that moment, Scott realized that all his choices, all his avoidance had brought Daniel here. He had no time to think. He picked up the phone and called an ambulance. While waiting, Scott sat next to Daniel, his hand shaking as he held his lover's. Scott realized that their love was not something that could be easily ended. It had been ingrained in him, and now it had left an irreversible legacy. Scott Allen, sitting in the darkness of his living room, felt the emptiness envelop him. For months he had tried to return to normal life, but all his efforts were in vain. Daniel's shadow was always present in every corner of his mind, like a wound that would never heal. That forbidden love, once passionate and captivating, had now become a burden that Scott could not shake off. After Daniel was rescued from the edge of life and death, Scott felt a brief sense of relief. But that relief was quickly replaced by a lingering fear that nothing could ever bring them back to the way they were. The love Scott once had for Daniel was now wrapped in guilt and remorse. He knew that he was the one who pushed Daniel to the brink of despair. The lies, the evasions, and the public rejection of his feelings had created an incurable wound. As time passed, Scott returned to his family, but the false peace was just a thin shell. During the quiet evenings with his family, he could not escape the feeling of guilt, as if every moment was a betrayal to his wife and children. Scott tried to hide the emptiness inside, trying to maintain the image of a model husband, but with each passing day, that feeling became heavier. The months after Scott left Daniel passed slowly and heavily. Daniel tried to move on, but the pain of Scott's betrayal did not fade easily. His heart was broken, not only by the love that was rejected, but also by the lies that Scott had told him. Every night, Daniel lay in the dark, remembering the moments with Scott, when they believed that love could overcome all barriers. But now he knew that it was all an illusion. The anger and pain in Daniel's heart grew, turning into an uncontrollable storm. Daniel was no longer the weak and vulnerable man. He had changed. The long, sleepless nights had transformed him into a different person, filled with resentment and determination to find justice for himself. The forbidden love was no longer just blind passion. It had become a battle to regain the honor that he felt Scott had stolen from him. Every time Daniel saw pictures of Scott and his family on social media, their happy smiles, their fake peace only made him hate them more. Why could Scott continue his life as if nothing had happened, while Daniel had to live in indescribable pain? He felt abandoned, pushed out of a life that he should have had a right to participate in. Jealousy and betrayal made Daniel even more blind, pushing him to the edge of sanity. The negative emotions inside Daniel kept growing. Every night he dreamed of Scott smiling happily with his family, while he was left in the dark without any hope. Every time he woke up, drenched in cold sweat, his heart pounding, Daniel knew that he could not let this situation continue. All those emotions needed an outlet, and Daniel knew exactly what he had to do. He began to monitor Scott from afar. Daniel knew Scott's schedule, knew when he usually came home, and even knew that Sarah, Scott's wife, was home on Saturday nights to take care of the children. Daniel realized that in his own hands he had the power to end all this suffering. No longer a victim of betrayal, Daniel now felt like he was in control of the fate of those who had hurt him. His determination and anger pushed him to limits he never thought he could overcome. A plan gradually formed in Daniel's mind. He knew he had to end this affair, not just with silence but with action. That night, as Daniel sat in the darkness of his small room, he decided that it was time for Scott and Sarah to pay for what they had done. Daniel was no longer a man who was willing to forgive and accept. He wanted justice, and the justice he sought would be bloody. Sarah had long noticed the subtle changes in Scott's behavior. He came home later, sometimes avoided her gaze, and every time he spoke to her, the intimacy seemed to have disappeared. Although Sarah did not want to believe the worst, a part of her began to suspect that her husband was hiding something. There were nights when she woke up in the middle of the night to find Scott sitting alone in the living room, his eyes dull and thoughtful. Sarah had wanted to ask him directly many times, but the fear of the truth kept her silent. Now, when she saw Daniel appear in their bedroom, all those suspicions seemed confirmed. Horror came over her as she understood that this relationship was not only a secret, but also the price of her and her husband's lives. One cold winter evening, Daniel quietly walked toward Scott's house. The sky was pitch black. not a single star, as if the whole universe was supporting his decision. His footsteps were light as he walked down the paved path leading to the courtyard. His feeling was no longer one of worry or regret. Instead, it was one of cold certainty. He knew what he was about to do, and there was nothing that could change his mind. The back door of the house was unlocked, as if fate had opened it for Daniel. Inside, the pale yellow light from the living room cast a false calm that Daniel had long hated. He entered the house, his steps slow and quiet. Everything was familiar to him, because he had been a part of Scott's life. This house, this atmosphere should have been his, but now it was only a distant memory. Daniel walked closer to Scott and Sarah's bedroom. The door was only ajar, and from inside he could hear the soft whispers, the giggles of the children who had gone to bed. They were living the life he could never have, and it tore Daniel's heart apart. His anger flared more than ever. He had come to seek justice, and nothing could stop him. In that moment, everything seemed to slow down. Daniel felt his heart pounding in his chest, his hands tightening around the knife he had brought with him. He knew that once he crossed that threshold, everything would change forever. But Daniel had no way back. Everything he had ever been, everything he had ever hoped for, had been destroyed by Scott and Sarah, and now he would pay them back for everything they had done to him. Daniel looked at Scott, the man he had loved so deeply, standing before him with fear in his eyes. Years of love, longing, and lies rolled over him like a flood. "I promised," Daniel whispered, his voice choked. "I promised you," but that promise had never been kept, and now he could no longer bear it. In that moment, it was not just Scott standing before him, but Daniel's entire life that had been lost. Everything he had dreamed of was now a broken dream. "You took everything from me," Daniel whispered, before the first stab of the knife pierced Scott's body. Daniel entered the room where Scott and Sarah were sitting on the bed. They both jumped at the sight of him, but it was too late. Panic was evident in Scott's eyes, but Daniel didn't give him a chance to explain or defend himself. The anger and pain he had endured for so long now turned into uncontrollable violence. He moved so fast that Scott had no time to react. For a brief moment, Daniel looked into Scott's eyes, feeling the fear and regret in them. But the regret came too late. Daniel was no longer a man who could forgive. With a quick slash of his knife, he ended Scott's life, as if it were a matter of fate. Sarah screamed in panic, but her screams echoed only in the silence of the night. Daniel, in his rage, could no longer hear anything but the screams of his heart. He had no intention of leaving any witnesses. Sarah, the woman Scott once loved, now suffered the same fate as her husband. Daniel felt no pleasure or satisfaction from his actions, only the cold silence of emptiness. The small house that Scott and Sarah shared was now filled with absolute silence, the silence of death. Daniel stood in the middle of the room, looking down at the two bodies lying motionless on the floor. He had done what he believed was justice, but in this moment everything seemed meaningless. Daniel did not feel the relief he had imagined. Instead, he felt only emptiness envelop his soul, as if all the pain and resentment had disappeared, leaving behind a gloomy silence. Daniel left the house, stepping out into the cold night. The sky was still black. But now, Daniel no longer felt the heaviness in his heart. He had done what he believed was right, but the price was an immeasurable loss. Everything that had once meant something to him was now the past. Daniel walked away, not looking back. In his mind, everything was over. Both Scott and Sarah paid the price for their betrayals, but Daniel's price was perhaps even greater. He lost everything, not just his love, but his very identity. There was nothing left but emptiness and darkness.